In choosing terminal illness as the subject for this movie, we're obviously choosing a very heavy subject matter, also something that was going to be very relevant to our viewers. Obviously, cancer doesn't choose its victims based on their character, and it's always been amazing to me to see how people of different character deal with the imminence of death. A diagnosis of cancer has the potential to completely destroy someone or the potential to completely empower that person to live. The character that we're presented with in Swan Song, Luke, is a character who's very isolated towards the beginning of the movie.
As the character development of Luke is produced throughout the movie, there are several things that you can really sympathize with the main character through. And there are points in the movie where you feel sorry for the main character. You feel sorry for Luke at the beginning just because his life seems to just be so mundane. You get this feeling that Luke is really not living his life to the fullest, and he's about to die. Throughout the movie, Luke is introduced to characters who handle life and death from different perspectives in different ways.
As Luke comes into contact with more and more characters throughout the movie, those relationships are really what eventually develops and even changes his character. When Luke comes into contact with Megan, he meets this character who's very confident, very individualistic, sure of herself. She's determined to live her life in a way that'll be worth living, and that slowly rubs off on Luke as he spends more time with Megan.
Megan in many ways changes Luke's perspective and view on life through her willingness to, in a sense, embrace her imminent death, and through that have life of her own. And you can really see that influence on Luke.
What we learn about the character of Craig, a stereotypical doctor who is in trouble due to malpractice, being faced with lawsuits, is that he was obviously almost forced into doing something he wouldn't ordinarily do, and he's pushed to make a decision that, if he was thinking straight, he probably would have never made. But once he makes this decision, he struggles throughout the film as he gets to know Luke and as he gets to know Megan. The more he gets to know them and the more that he sees what this tragedy is doing in their lives, the more he regrets the decision that he originally made.
Another character that Luke meets up with along the way in the meetings is Glenn. Glenn being kind of an older guy dealing with really the same problems.
The character Glenn, who we're introduced to, is a character who is really the only one of the characters who is actually suffering from cancer. Of course, Megan and Luke both think they have cancer. Of course, Craig pretends like he has cancer to play along in this game they're playing. But Glenn is really the only character who we get to peer into who's really suffering with cancer. And Glenn is portrayed as being very religious. He's very focused on these spiritual ideas that he keeps on trying to push onto Luke. Luke isn't very receptive to those ideas at first, but of course whenever Glenn dies, Luke is affected by that, and it shows that Glenn really did have an influence on Luke.
As we're introduced to Walter Chapman, the author posing as a doctor, at the end of the movie, you're left with mixed feelings. In several ways, you feel that Walter Chapman is responsible for the final tragedy in Luke and Megan's lives. And yet, in the same sense, Chapman is indirectly responsible for Luke re-exploring the definition of life.
It's interesting to take note that all of the primary characters in this movie are in a state of desperation. Of course, Luke and Megan are both struggling with this idea of death. And on the other side, you have Walter Chapman, who is desperate for a novel idea, so desperate, in fact, that he resorts to unethical means to obtain that novel. You also have Craig, who, because of his malpractice lawsuits, makes a decision that he comes to regret. And really, Swan Song is all about showing how these characters come to grow and develop through the circumstances they're surrounded with. What really drew me to Swan Song was the concept. And we really wanted the viewer to look at this movie for the concept that's behind it and ask themselves these same questions that the main character had to face throughout the movie. To ask themselves, if I were in this situation, if I found out that my life was going to be much shorter than I originally thought, how would that change the way that I handle things? How would that change my attitude about life?
The question is brought up from the concept of Swan Song of how do we really define our lives? Do we define ourselves through our jobs? We define ourselves through the relationships that we have or the relationships that we don't have. We define ourselves by the excitement that's present in our lives. And Swan Song really brings out that question that we all have. The questions that are brought to his mind are the questions that we all deal with, that we all face. They just seem clearer the closer we get to death, and that is what happens to us after we die. Is there a God? How will I be defined? And as we see in the story, Luke brings out his own definition. It takes the terminal illness to do that.
Despite the huge tragedy that Luke faces when he finds out that he's going to die of cancer, the fact remains that he's still just one face in the midst of an entire crowd of people. And what Swan Song really does is it brings to light one story out of a whole crowd of stories.
His face is brought out of that crowd, and he's given a name, and his story is told through his reaction to a terminal illness. And the beauty of the message of Swan Song is that Luke is the one responsible for creating that definition. He is no longer then defined by his job or even by the shock factor of having a terminal illness, but he's rather defined by the relationships that he has. He's defined by his individual creativity. He begins to realize that his life previously had no definition, and he begins to really care about how he defines his life.
Needless to say, movies ending with a twist is pretty common these days, but ending with a twist wasn't really our purpose in making Swan Song. Our purpose wasn't to surprise the audience. Our purpose was to pose a question to the audience. When Luke finds out that he doesn't really have cancer, he is faced with a very crucial decision. Is he going to take what he learned and apply it to his life even though he's seemingly back to normal? Or is he going to go back to the way he was before he ever found out that he had cancer to start with?
There's so many questions that are surrounded with the ending of Swan Song. Immediately, as a viewer, you wonder, well, do they ever get back together? Does Luke ever come back? Does anyone ever piece this thing together? I think sometimes in film and cinema, we as viewers become so attached to happy endings. I'm afraid we forget the beauty of tragedy. And in the ending of Swan Song, the ending is very seemingly tragic, and yet the message doesn't change. And what we leave the audience with is this idea that tragedy is a necessary part of life, and to see how the characters react, to see how the characters cope with tragedy in their lives, it really exemplifies the necessity of tragedy for growth. And really, that's the beauty of the tragic ending. We're forced to realize that life is unpredictable, and we're forced to realize that life is, in some way, beautifully tragic.
And this powerful message that is behind Swan Song is really what motivated me in working on this project. And it's one thing to make a movie about a neat concept, something that's just interesting to think about. Just another thing to make a movie that actually has application in the lives of the viewer. Obviously, the ending to Swan Song is not a happy ending at all. But life isn't about happy endings. Life is about experience that brings about change. And that's really the theme to Swan Song, is that experience brings about change. And at the end, the way that Swan Song ends very openly, with a lot of things left unanswered, Luke is faced with this same decision that we want to pose to the audience. And that decision is the experience that he just went through going to bring about lasting change in his life? What am I going to do with the knowledge that life is short, with the knowledge that life is valuable? If you walk away from Swan Song disappointed in the ending, then you missed it.